Have you ever seen the movie or play Newsies? Well, what you may not have known about it is that it was inspired by a real-life event that occurred in 1899. What led up to the event was tragic, yet triumphant in the end. In the late 1800s, there were boys, some girls too, who were called newsies. They sold newspapers on the street for 1 cent a paper. They could buy a stack of 100 papers for just 50 cents. The only way they could make a profit was if they sold all their papers, because they had to have enough to buy tomorrow's papers, and they had to pay for the papers they didn't sell. Most of these kids were very poor, some even homeless, quote-unquote, street urchins. The two newspaper giants, William Randolph Hearst, who owned the Evening Journal, and Joseph Pulitzer, who owned the competitor, the Evening World, decided to raise the price of 100 papers from 50 cents to 60 cents because the Spanish-American War was just around the corner. Wars were horrible for everybody, except for those in the newspaper business. People loved to buy newspapers covering wars. There were no TVs or computers to show the news, so they were sure enough to buy a 1-cent paper. Plus, the papers tended to over-sensationalize or exaggerate stories so they could sell more copies. This is called yellow journalism. The conditions for the newsies were unbelievably bad. Their shoes were worn out, they were hungry, and often huddled together at night in a stairway to keep warm if they had no home. After the newspaper prices weren't lowered post-war, sales decreased because people did not crave the war coverage news. The newsies were left with many unsold papers. This was a tragic situation. Life was already hard enough when they could sell all their papers. So they decided to go on a strike and boycott selling newspapers until Hearst and Pulitzer lowered the price per 100 papers back to 50 cents or lower. Their goal was to make sure that the newspaper tycoons would treat them like true members of their newspaper business. This is how the strike took place. A few kids decided to hold large meetings to explain why and how they should boycott. They quickly managed to organize over 100 newsies who attended early meetings. For 2 weeks, 5,000 newsies boycotted their positions, filling all the streets, causing major traffic in downtown Manhattan, giving a lot of tension to them. They also successfully closed down the Brooklyn Bridge for several days, which was a major inconvenience to business and people. However, closing it down really made the people sympathetic to the newsies' tragic situation at hand. When the newspaper giants tried to hire bums and older men, they declined out of respect to the newsies' demands of better working conditions. The paper's advertisers wanted credit on their bills on account of the strike. They didn't want to pay full price for ads if people weren't getting and reading the newspaper. The wealthy publishers realized this newsy strike was serious. The boys were cutting circulations by 2/3, and within days, the strike was spreading to other towns and states nearby New York. The event even inspired Newsboys strikes to occur in other parts of the country, such as Montana, Oregon, Kentucky. There were some scabs who betrayed the boycott and sold papers anyway. There were serious brawls and injuries, which just added more to the tragic situation for these young workers. Solidarity meant everything to these boys. Known as the leader of the newsies, Kid Blink, who wore an eye patch, famously said, "Ain't that 10 cents worth as much to us as it is to Hearst and Pulitzer, who are millionaires? Well, I guess it is. If they can't spare it, how can we? I'm trying to figure out how 10 cents to 100 papers can mean more to a millionaire than it does to newsboys, and I can't see it." It's important to point out that the newsboys decided to treat a lady like a lady, even if she decided to sell a paper. They would generally splash water on a newsstand owner during the strike, unless a woman worked the newsstand. "A feller don't soak a lady," Kid Blink proclaimed. Finally, the publishing tycoons negotiated with the newsies. The price would remain 60 cents per 100 papers, but the World and the Journal would take back unsold papers at full refund. This was a huge triumphant outcome for the Newsies, giving them hope and a pathway out of their tragic livelihoods. Going forward, as of August 2nd, 1899, they knew they could purchase the newspapers each morning at Newspaper Row and make a profit even if they could not sell all their papers. Things have definitely improved for a newsie over the years. Roughly 50 years after the Newsboys strike of 1899, Charles Leonard was working his own paper route. Charles was 13 and tossed papers from his Cushman scooter in Shreveport, Louisiana. The paper went to subscribers, so he did not have to buy back any papers. However, he says part of the job was going door to door monthly to collect money. He said, "This was horrible because frequently no one was home, resulting in my having to go back time and time again. There were also a few people who simply would not pay, so neither the paper nor I got paid." Fast forward to today, where papers like the West Volusia Beacon are primarily mailed to subscribers. Barb Shepard, its owner and publisher, and Anthony DeFeo, its news editor, explain distribution and the role of children. How is your paper distributed to homes and to businesses?
Well, the Beacon is very proud of the fact that our newspaper is delivered by mail. A lot of people don't understand that the way a newspaper exists is by selling advertising. So what we have to think about is always excellent news content, but also giving the advertiser value. So with our newspapers being mail delivered right into the home, we feel like that gives a good value to the advertiser.
Does the Beacon require its salespeople to buy back unsold papers?
No, we do have two older gentlemen, it actually happens to be, who take copies of the Beacon to store locations where they're sold. In contrast to the Newsies model, where you had younger people generally on the streets selling individual copies, our program is more like to take 20 copies to the 7-Eleven and have those available there for sale. And if there are unsold papers, that's the Beacon's problem. It's not our delivery or salesperson's problem.
What is the minimum age of a Beacon employee?
Well, I can kind of take that one. So actually right now we have an intern who is only 15 years old. She goes to University High School. And so, we have had high schoolers in the past be interns. I don't know if in the past there's been anybody younger than that, but there's really no hard and fast minimum from what I understand.
One way for younger people to get involved in the Beacon is by submitting letters to the editor. Young people have opinions on important topics, and they're important opinions, and we're always happy once in a while, and I think this has happened actually with St. Barnabas. Teachers will encourage their students to write letters to the editor, and we're happy to have those. We're especially happy to have the viewpoints of the other people in our community.
So when you watch Newsies, be proud of the real Newsies and realize their triumph, which inspired other Newsboy strikes and was also a first step in the long road ahead of child labor laws and enforcement efforts. We owe a great deal of gratitude to the Newsboys. Extra, extra, remember the Newsboy strike of 1899, both the tragedy and the triumph.